Yo, what up, though? Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Street Coder Nate, and today I'm bringing y'all a new playlist. This playlist is about asynchronous JavaScript. You probably heard of async or sync, but today we talking about asynchronous JavaScript. We're gonna talk a little bit about synchronicity as well, but this part right here, this is what kind of scares people from JavaScript is its ability to do asynchronous operations. So today we're gonna demystify all of that through this series. First, we're gonna start talking about callbacks. So let's get into that lesson right now. Okay, so here we go. A JavaScript callback. Let's get it. Oh, and I've changed it up a little bit. I'm in y'all face, and now I can point all over the screen and whatnot. We're gonna have some fun today in the rest of this series. Okay, so JavaScript callbacks. What are JavaScript callbacks? So let's take a deep. W3 Schools, it got this little quote right here. It said, "I will call back later." What is it referring to? I will call back later. A callback is a function passed as an argument to another function. Right, so you have a function call and you could pass another function into that. So the function that's running in the function that's running that, let me try this again. So you can pass a function to a function and the function that accepts the function that is passed to it, it can run that function inside of it. Really convoluted. I know. So we're gonna demystify all of this. This technique allows a function to call another function. So if you pass a function into another function, well, the function that it's just like passing a variable into a function. That function can use the variables inside of it. Well, if you pass a function, let's say let's call this function 1. So if you pass function 1 to function 2, function 2 can call function 1 inside of itself, right? Just like if you pass the variable to function 2, function 2 would be able to call that variable inside of itself as well. It's the same exact thing, except we're not passing variables anymore, we're passing functions. And the reason that we're able to pass functions is because in JavaScript, every single thing is an object. So passing a variable is literally like passing a variable, and passing the functions are literally just passing objects. So let's get back to that. A callback function can run another function, can run after another function has finished. So this is real cool. So let's say you were running some operation on a function and then you needed some other function to run right afterwards. This is the point of the callback. You can say, in this function, I'm going to run these set of commands, and after these set of commands have finished, I need to run this function. Well, you pass that function into the function that's running those set of commands, and at the end, you call back to the function that was passed in. That's why it's called a callback. Dope. Okay, so function sequence. You gotta kind of understand the order of how things are fired in JavaScript in order to understand the difference between synchronicity and asynchronicity. So JavaScript functions are executed in the sequence that they are called, not in the sequence that they are defined. So you know, like when you got a JavaScript file, and let's say, oops, you know how you got a why does it keep doing that? You know how you got a JavaScript file, like right here, and in the JavaScript file, you can just define a few. You can define a few functions, right? So let's call this one func1, and that's going to equal an arrow function like that, and then we can call func2, and that equals like these, another function. Cool. So basically what that statement just said was that functions aren't fired off in the order that they're defined. Remember, right here, all I'm doing is defining these functions. I define function 1 and I just define function 2. Obviously, they don't have anything in them. So let's just call like console.log, and we'll just say func1, and then we'll do the same thing in this function, but we'll call this one func2. Cool. So if you're paying attention over here, or my bad, if you're paying attention, let me help myself out. If you are paying attention to what's happening over on the, there we go, over here, this is where, this is the browser actually. So I made the browser headless and I'm just using the console, as you can see right at the top. So I'm using the headless browser, and as you can see, all the thing that's printing out is file loaded, file loaded, file loaded. Well, that's because, I mean, I refreshed the page multiple times. But now, okay, let me refresh the page now. Here we got, it's just file loaded. Why didn't console log, or why didn't func1 or func2 get printed out? Well, that's because we never called them. All we did, that's because we never called them. All we did was define them. We defined them func1, func2, but we never called these actual functions right here. So what we're gonna have to do is call them in an order. Basically, so going back to W3 schools is saying JavaScript functions are executed in the sequence that they are called, not in the sequence they are defined, right? They are executed in the sequence that they are called, not defined. So let's go back over to the code. And what do I mean? Well, here, these are definitions. These are just definitions of functions. So now if I want to call these functions, I have to go func1 like that, and this is calling func1. And so as you can see, now in the Safari browser at the bottom, you'll see func1 is being called, or func1 is being printed out right there. Func2 isn't being printed out because func2 wasn't called yet. So let's call on func2 like that, save it, and you see now on the right hand side in the browser, you see that func2 right here is now printed out as well. And as you can see, if I switch the ordering 2 to 1, remember func1, oh wait, shoot, my bad, I can't see. 2 to 1, if I change the order right here from 1 to 2, or from 2, my bad, it was func1 first, and now func2 is first, and func1 is second. But as you can see, func1 was defined first, and func2 is defined second, but I'm calling func2 first, and then func1 right afterwards. So let's see what happens. Refresh or let me save it. And as I saved it, you can see back over here on the browser, in the console, that func2 was printed out, then func1. This is basically what W3 Schools is saying. It's saying that functions are not called, or functions, let me get back to the, you just read it right there. It says JavaScript functions are executed in the sequence that they are called, not in the sequence they are defined. So whenever you want to call on a function, make sure that you pretty much just know that when you're defining a function, it's not calling that function. And when you want to actually call it, you have to use those parentheses around the name. So they're going to give an example that we pretty much just did here, where they got first function is up right here, and then the second function, they called the first function and the second function, right? But then they switched it around and called this, my second function and my first function, to show you that you don't have to call it in the order that you define it. Cool. This is going to help us get into what's called sequence control. So let's tap in with sequence control and see exactly what sequence control is on. Okay, so it says sequence control is sometimes you would like to have better control over when to execute a function, right? So you want better control when to execute functions. Suppose you want to do a calculation and then display the result. You could call a calculator function, save the result, and then call another function to display the result, right? That's how we typically would do it in computer science. You know, you got this function right here. That's going to, we got this function, my calculator, and that will save the result. You could, that will calculate the function and save the result. And then we're going to take that value that we get from calculate function, and then we're going to pass it into my displayer, and then it will be displayed onto the screen. Two different function calls, back to back though. Okay, so here's that example that we just talked about. You got my displayer, and as you see, my displayer is just document.getElement by ID demo. So there's an element, an HTML element on a web page with the titled demo, and we're setting this inner HTML to some value that was passed in from the caller, right? And then we got this other function right here. It's my calculator, and it takes in number 1 and number 2. Now it's gonna give a sum, which is 1 plus 2, or number 1 plus 2, and then it's gonna return that sum. So let's see what's happening. These are, remember, those two, 1, 2, definition, not execution. We're not calling on it. So we're just defining what these functions look like right here. Now what we're going to do is take a look at this line right here. See, this line is a fun line. This line calls our myCalculator function and passes in 5 and 5 as parameters. That's really cool because then we save that result into result. And then we call myDisplayer, and then displays the damn 10 onto the screen. Dope. Okay. Or you could call a calculator function, my function, and let the calculator function call the display function. See, now this is where callbacks is starting to get dope, because as you can see before, we had to, we had to call 2 different functions separately. So we got my calculator is gonna be called, and then my displayer afterwards is gonna be called. And let's go back to the idea that you don't call in the order that you define, right? You don't call in the order that you define, because as you can see, my displayer, or you don't execute in the order that you define. So my displayer did not go before my calculator. As you can see, they call my calculator before my displayer, but my calculator is defined after my displayer. Cool. So that's important, because coming back here, or you could call a calculator function, my calculator, and let the calculator function call the display function. So what does that mean? So if we come back to this example right here, they're saying that instead of having my calculator have these 2 functions do it like this, and have my calculator return the sum, what we're going to do is allow my calculator to calculate the sum, and then call my display. It's going to call my displayer right inside of its own function. But in order to get access to my displayer, we have to pass it in to the my calculator function as like a reference, right? Like, because num1 is a reference, num2 is a reference. So whenever we pass in functions, we're also going to pass in references to functions. And remember, a reference is just like a name, an identifier for a pile of data or pile of operations to run. Okay, so let's take a look. So here is an example how we would typically do it in computer science and different languages, where you define my function above, but then inside of my calculator, what you will be doing is just calling the my function right there. Like there's no big difference there, right? Like we already know how to do that, and it will do exactly what we needed to do. Okay, so the problem here, though, the problem with the first example above is that you have to call 2 functions to display the results. The problem with the second example is that you cannot prevent the calculator function from displaying the result. So, like every single time num1 plus num2 or my calculator gets ran, num1 plus num2 will be set equal to the sum, and then my displayer is going to run every single time. There's no way that we can tell my displayer not to run, unless, I mean, we're using if statements and stuff, but let's see JavaScript way of doing it. Now it's time to bring in a callback. So if, like, where is it? The problem with the second example is that you cannot prevent the calculator function from displaying the result. So now it's time to bring in callbacks. That's the issue right there. The first issue is that you have to make 2 calls, and then the second issue is, okay, well, we can just call the other function inside of this function, but then that brings about a second issue is, like, what if we don't want to display the results? You know, what if there's an error in our calculation and we don't want to display that result, right? So the reason, the way that JavaScript fixes all of that is through this mechanism called callbacks. My bad, it's called callbacks. A callback is a function passed as an argument to another function. That's all it is. I've been explaining this the whole time. We're going to pass a reference to a function we're going to pass a reference that's pointing to a function, and that function that is passed into will call that callback and basically have more control over when it's called and how it's called. Let's see. Using a callback, you could call the calculator function with the callback and let the calculator function run the callback after the calculation is finished. Let's take a look. So we have my displayer again, and it's the same thing, but my calculator looks a little different. This time my calculator is taking in one more parameter, and that parameter is my callback. And so we set the let sum equal sum num1 plus num2, and then we just called up my callback right there on the sum. So in the example above, my displayer is the name of the function. It is passed to my calculator as an argument. When you pass a function as an argument, remember not to use parentheses. This is important. So when you pass a function to another function, you just want to use the function name. Now, if you say, like in this example right here, in the wrong example where it says my calculator, and then at the end we pass in my display with the parentheses, what's that's doing? When you put the parentheses around it, you're actually running that function. Now, when you just say that function's name, the reference, all that does is bring up the reference, almost like an address in memory where the function lives. And so basically that's what we're doing. We're passing in this address in memory where this function lives, and then the function, like my calculator, the function that is passed into has control, will then use this reference the right way with the parentheses around it and actually call it when it needs to be called. Cool. So when to use a callback. So these examples honestly was basic as hell, and it was like, I know you probably thinking like, I still would just rather do it the other way. And I feel you, but get this idea in your head of passing functions into other functions as references and having the function that is passed into control its execution, because soon what we're going to get into is asynchronous programming. In the next video is asynchronous programming, and asynchronous programming is all about callbacks. And so if you don't understand that syntax on callbacks, I know this was basic again, very basic example, but if you don't understand the syntax and understand what's really going on, you're not really going to understand asynchronous functions. And so once again, where callbacks really shine are in asynchronous functions, where one function has to wait for another function, like waiting for a file to load. Remember, I told you got control over the execution. So asynchronous functions are covered in the next video. Without further ado, we're going to call this one. I don't know where the damn mouse at. There we go. All right, we're going to call this video. Great video. Like always, follow me on the ground. You know, Street Coder Nate. Like, comment. I see some of y'all starting to comment now. Thank you. Thank you. Someone commented the other day asking for help with milliseconds, and just use the get date operation if you do a date object and then you say .get date, it's going to actually return to you the milliseconds. And so most programmers are trying to figure out how to convert from those milliseconds to actual seconds, hours, and minutes. So yeah, just using a .get date will actually give you, or get time, my bad, .get time will actually give you the time in milliseconds. All right. But yeah, so in that sense, continue asking questions, continue being a dope person for real, a dope street coder. Share the videos and let me know what y'all think in the comments. I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.